Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to the Talking Ideas session this evening. My name's Andrew Bonnell. I'm an associate professor in history at the University of Queensland. My special area of interest is modern German history. I studied German history in the 1980s and started to teach it, and spent some time studying in Berlin in the 80s, and I've been following events in Germany since then, so this evening's topic is of particular interest to me. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's Looking Back at Stasiland with Anna Funder as part of the State Library's Talking Ideas series. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the land of the traditional owners and custodians, and we pay our respects to all of their elders, past, present and future, specifically to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples of the Brisbane area who never ceded sovereignty over this territory. And the State Library is pleased to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their continuing custodians to the land and their role as custodians of stories on this site for thousands of years. Tonight we're looking at the theme of writing from recent history and reflecting on Anna Funder's work Stasiland as still a significant text to help understand recent world politics. And I'm sure Anna will also be reflecting on the legacy of the Stasi and the legacy of East Germany today, and also talking about her personal approach to researching recent history. Anna will be in conversation with another author, Kristina Olsson, and they're joining us shortly. I have to mention that the State Library, as a respected cultural institution, seeks to provide a safe and welcoming space for everyone. Tonight's event is part of the State Library's Talking Ideas series, which aims to entertain, inspire and foster debate and to address issues that inform our times. Following the conversation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please save your questions until the question time at the end of the conversation between Anna and Kristina, and then we ask that people do ask questions and keep them relatively brief so that others can have question time rather than providing a comment as well. As you came in tonight, you might have noticed some images on the screen from the State Library's online digital image collection. Some of these images are from the Second World War period, some are from the year 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, although obviously of Brisbane rather than Berlin. These images are just a small sample of some of the Queensland stories you can explore in the State Library collection. Anna Funder is an internationally acclaimed author whose debut book, Stasiland, recounted the personal stories of people who were victims of the East German secret police known as the Stasi, and also interviewed some people who had worked for the Stasi in one capacity or another. The book won a number of international awards, including the Samuel Johnson Prize. Today being the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, this seems a particularly auspicious day to have a conversation with Anna Funder. As far as my own connection with the events is concerned, I wasn't actually in Berlin on the 9th of November 1989. I had spent a year in Berlin earlier in the 80s when the wall was still standing. But I did get to spend some time in Berlin and East Germany a couple of months after the wall opened, and it was a fascinating time when there seemed to be an openness to all kinds of possibilities, and I got the opportunity to talk to quite a few people about their experiences of East Germany and their aspirations for the future at that particular moment in history. Unfortunately, when the Germans commemorate the 9th of November, no anniversary in German history is simple, because the 9th of November is also the anniversary of the Revolution of 1918, which sought to establish the first democracy in Germany, which only sort of resulted in the incomplete establishment of democracy in the Weimar Republic. And it's also the anniversary of in 1938, of the Nazi outburst of violence against German Jews known as Kristallnacht, where many Jews were murdered and thousands thrown into concentration camps and synagogues burned. So the 9th of November isn't a day that the Germans could celebrate as a national holiday. So the national holiday is now the 3rd of October, commemorating the date the Unification Treaty came into effect in 1990. But today around the world, people are commemorating and remembering the opening of the Berlin Wall on 9th of November 1989, so this is a good occasion for this particular conversation with Anna Funder. This evening our chair, who will be in conversation with Anna, is Kristina Olsson, a writer, journalist and teacher. Kristina is the author of the non-fiction book Boy Lost, a Family Memoir, which won the 2013 Queensland Literary Award for the best non-fiction work and the Nita Kibble Literary Award. In her most recent novel, Kristina uses the building of the Sydney Opera House as the backdrop for a story about personal guilt and political upheaval. I'll now vacate the podium and ask you to please welcome Anna Funder and Kristina Olsson. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear us at the back? Yeah? Yeah, great.
Can you hear me too? Yes, excellent.
That's the most important thing. I'm not sure what Andrew said to you, but I imagine he welcomed you here. I'm going to do it again. Welcome to this very special event with the very wonderful Anna Funder. Very delighted to have her here. As we celebrate this 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down and also celebrate Anna's remarkable book, Stasiland. We also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place we meet on today, people who walked this land for a very long time before us, many thousands of years, and who told stories here. Stories have always been told on this land. Of course, as we speak, spectacular celebrations are already happening and are being unleashed all over Berlin and in other parts of Germany to celebrate what happened on November 9, 1989. There's concerts and lectures and readings and exhibitions and interactive installations and parties, very big parties. And I guess they'll all culminate in about 8 hours from now. Is it 8 hours, Anna? Roughly at the time the first East Berliners, of course, hoisted themselves up over that wall. So we're going to talk about the wall, of course, what it meant in time and space and imagination. But we're also, of course, celebrating the publication in 2002, of a book that actually got beneath the skin of the wall itself, if you like, beneath its physical and metaphorical meanings, I think, and gave really vivid life to both those who had lived and been imprisoned in an authoritarian and dehumanizing state, and to those who enforced it, of course, the Stasi. The book's a very courageous act of witness, I think, and it's so stylishly written, as many of you will know, that you don't realise, not at first, that we're actually reading the most extraordinary hybrid of serious, very serious journalism, history and human portraiture. So Anna, welcome to Queensland.
Thank you very much.
Where, of course, we have our own historical version of the authoritarian state. One that fell, ironically, in the same year and within a month of the fall of the wall. some
Were
of
they,
the
were they
people-
connected?
no.
The machinations of the Bjelke state.
That's right.
The
Well,
spores underground.
we might get to that later. There are some echoes, I think, much more minor, of course. But Anna, I want to ask you first where you were 30 years ago on the night of November 9 and how you reacted to the news.
Oh, first of all, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me in this beautiful city, in this beautiful library, and for that amazing introduction. I think that's the best I've had.
Oh.
That's the best I've had.
Fully deserved.
30 years ago, I was a student at the university in Melbourne, and I'd been an undergraduate student for a couple of years, and some of that time I'd been studying in West Berlin. So 87, 88, I was an undergraduate student at the Free University
That's right.
in West Berlin. And then I came back to Melbourne where I was studying, and I just didn't have 2 cents to rub together. And I watched that whole year as the Monday demonstrations went on every night, starting in Leipzig in March and then going on. And you will have seen all the pictures of the candle-bearing demonstrators and so on. And I just couldn't get the money together. I just didn't have an airfare, so I never got there. And in retrospect, I think, and I had friends who were living in Berlin, and they were all really excited and everything. And in retrospect, I don't think I would have been quite as sort of obsessed with finding out what had happened if I'd been able to be there. So maybe it was quite a good thing that I missed out.
That you
I
weren't
don't know.
there, yeah. But did your time as a student there also, like kindle that fire?
Yes, I mean, I really, I have daughters, my teenage daughters at the moment, and when I think back to that time, kind of my late teens and early 20s, I just think how dangerous it is, because what you expose yourself to, or who you expose yourself to, I don't mean literally, and the sort of things that grab your passionate attention, whether they're things about art or things about justice or things about literature or things about politics, are extremely formative. And when I was 20, I was living in West Berlin. As I said, I was a student at the Free University, and I fell in kind of accidentally with a group of people who were quite a lot older than I was, who were artists and writers who'd been kicked out of East Germany. So they were living in West Berlin, but we would, say, have dinner in Kreuzberg in a restaurant, and at the end of the street would be the wall, which was kind of, I mean, when you look back on it, it's so bizarre to have this monstrous, huge wall at the end of the street, which wasn't a wall. It was one wall and then a big sand strip and guard towers and another wall. And I knew that over that wall, my friends had left, wives and partners and parents and children and been kicked out. And I think I was intrigued by these people. I really admired them. And I just always thought to myself, what kind of place is it that kicks out its best and brightest, and the people who are going to essentially use their art or literature, I guess, to speak truth to power in some way. A more intelligent or a more politically minded person would have found the answer without going to the trouble that I went to. But I think that was the impetus.
Yeah. But your interest really crystallizes, doesn't it, with the realization that in the early 1990s, just a few years after the wall goes down, no one's much interested in what happened to the people of East Germany. And it also, I think, yes, crystallizes really when you meet a woman called Miriam and hear her story. And later, I think, to my mind anyway, Julia, I'm very much interested in both these women. But they seem to me to be a microcosm, almost symbolic of what happened to people in the GDR. Can you give us a little précis of what happened when you decided to go, well, actually, I'm interested and I'm going to go take a look?
Yeah, so I was back and forth between Melbourne and Berlin for some time, and I had varying kind of fellowships and Goethe Institute things, and a thing called the Australian German Association Fellowship and stuff. And I had to write a report for one of these fellowships, and in the writing of that, I just wrote that I'd heard a story of somebody who tried to climb the Berlin Wall, and whose husband had died in mysterious circumstances in custody. And as I was writing it, it occurred to me how bizarre it was that I was writing that, how extreme it was to be writing that. And then I went back to Germany. I sort of saved up my money and I left my life, really. I mean, I was working as an international lawyer for the Australian government, and I had this nice boyfriend, and I had this kind of ostensibly nice job, and I should have stayed. I just left everything and everyone and went to Berlin and tried to find this woman. In 1997, I just sort of saved up all my pennies and left. And I kind of can't believe no one stopped me.
This is how we look back on some of those things.
Yeah, this is how you look back. This is how you look back. Yeah, this is how you look back on these things. That boyfriend is now my husband, so he kind of really just sort of waited and stuck it out. And I went to the Stasi Museum, it's a place called the Runde Ecke that some of you may well have been to, which is the former Stasi headquarters in Leipzig. And so that is where everybody in Saxony was surveyed from, and where the orders were made to follow this person, to, wreck this life, to stop this education, to imprison so and so. At the end of 1989, the demonstrators stormed that building, and then it had been open since 1990. Essentially, from overnight, it was the offices of the Secret Service, and then it was the Museum of the Officers of the Secret Service with exactly the same stuff on it, and the calendar still on the wall, the filing cabinet still there, the ashtrays, the fake moustaches, the glue, or the smell sampling equipment. I can go into that later. It's so disgusting. And I went and I started talking to this woman there who was there by herself, and it turned out that I just describe all of this in Stasiland, that she was, her name was Frau Hollitzer, she was running the museum, and she said to me, yes, I think I can find Miriam for you, she might want to talk to you, I will let you know. And then she did, and I went to see this woman, Miriam, whose story really bookends the book, and it was so much more than I'd bargained for, what she told me. And I was flatting with friends in Berlin, which is 2 hours by train, and I can remember meeting Miriam, hearing the beginnings of this story that went into the book, going back to the flat in Berlin, and I said to my flatmate, this is it. I found the story that is going to anchor this book. And this person quite rightly looked at me and said, this is the first thing that you found. It can't possibly be the anchoring story for your book. And also didn't say, but looked at me like, and who says you can write a book anyway? But I think you get a kind of feeling, it could have been wrong, but it was right, where there's a kind of electricity. Everything that Miriam told me was so extraordinary. You say it encapsulates a lot about the regime, and it does, and it did, and it was clear that it was going to. So this is a woman who, when she was 16 in 1968, in Leipzig, the government pulled, Leipzig is a city of churches, very beautiful churches, and the government just pulled one down without notifying anybody or any public consultation. I have to say in brackets that my husband is an lapsed architect and now an urban planner, and he quite likes working for dictatorial regimes because they don't have to consult with anybody. So we not that he necessarily does a lot of that, but there's something really, in terms of ripping down buildings and making new ones, like authoritarian regimes are really fantastic. But in this, you might know that in Queensland, I don't know. In this particular instance, a church was ripped down in Leipzig, and Miriam at 16 and a friend of hers, Ursula, put up little leaflets around town, which they made with like a letraset ink set, and kind of ran off these things, and at night slapped them up around town with glue, which was illegal. They knew it was illegal, but it was almost like a teenage prank thing. But the Stasi came after them and arrested them and stuck them in custody for a month without calling their parents, and did the whole thing of talking to one and saying, well, the other one's confessed, and talking to the other one's confessed, and so on and so forth. And then let Miriam out and said, okay, well, you're out of remand now, but you're going to go on trial. And in the interim between being on remand and being on trial, this 16-year-old kid who'd never been to Berlin got on a train, went to Berlin and tried to climb the wall. That wasn't the story that I necessarily thought I was getting. I thought I was going to get something else. But then it leads into how a whole life is sort of, once you start doing something that you think is right and the authorities come down on you so hard, sometimes some people just dig in and they have this kind of conscience and courage where they just say, no, I'm absolutely right. And the more they come after me, the stronger I'm going to stand my ground, even this 16-year-old girl. So I think really what I was interested in, even if I didn't know it so explicitly, was this kind of something at the core of human beings that is sort of hard and bright and formed under pressure, really like you're writing about rocks at the moment, you told me, really like a diamond, this diamond core which will not be corrupted, and you can see it in so many people in so many circumstances. But that was what I was interested in, Miriam and Julia and Sigrid Paul and Klaus.
Yeah, you can almost see the scales falling from their eyes when they realise what it is and what their life is going to be now, which is fighting this thing. But then you take this quite audacious step, I think, of putting an ad in the personal columns of the paper. Remember those things?
No, that's not fair. That's not fair. I didn't mean to do that.
I didn't know that, Anna. I thought that was the intention.
I know. These things, they look intended. They're not intended. Like literature, it looks like you had an intent to say that and you didn't know what was coming.
So what happened?
Oh, well, I was finding people like Miriam and the others in the book. And then I thought, well, I really need to see the other side of this. They were all talking to me about being followed or having your life changed and manipulated by people that you couldn't see but you knew it was happening, or being in an interrogation and being, just taken off the street in a big black car and whatever it was. So I thought I need to talk to some of these Stasi men. They were all men. I'm not using the word man like to encompass anybody else. It was a men's club organised in a kind of military ranks, like a military organisation, the Secret Service. I thought, well, I better go and talk to some of them. And this was in 1997 when I was spending the whole year in Berlin writing the book. And I met this young woman at a party who's doing her master's, a young, serious German academic, proper, studious scholar person and she asked me what I was doing. And I said, I'm just going to go and talk to some Stasi men. And she says, oh, I'm doing that for my master's. And I can tell you now, none of them will talk to you. They've all gone to ground and you won't find any. And I said, oh, maybe that is, how do you know that? And she said, because I wrote a letter and I leafleted, that was Miriam, put it in the letterboxes in Marzahn, in these buildings where lots of Stasi lived, and also in Potsdam. And she said, I wrote 147 letters saying, I'm a master's student, I'd like to talk to you, will you talk to me? And she got 3 replies, and they were all anonymous reasons why the men would not talk to her. So she had good reason for thinking no one would talk to me. And I thought, well, I don't have the patience or skill to do that properly like that, and it looks a bit doomed anyway. So maybe I'll just take out an ad in the paper in these areas where the Stasi live. So the one in the paper in Potsdam was called the Märkische Allgemeine Zeitung. And my German is okay. I mean, I was doing all of this in German, but I just thought maybe there were kind of, if you're writing an ad, there might be like particular abbreviations you need to use and things like that you need to say, because I was paying by the letter and I had no money. And I got this German person who I really do think was well-intentioned towards me. Like, I don't think she was trying to trick me in any way or, put me in some kind of dire hole. But when this ad came out, it turned out to have gone for some reason into the personal columns of this newspaper in Potsdam, read by all these Stasi blokes, and it said, Australian writer seeks Stasi men. And then it was like viewed conversation, And I think it actually also said discretion guaranteed, which, I didn't.
But you got some replies.
I
you
got
know,
some
that-
replies. So this is well before mobile phones, and so I sat in my really decrepit apartment in East Berlin, former Eastbourne, but it still was totally Eastern. Had been lived in by a bunch of anarchists since the wall fell, and it was too rotten for the anarchists to live in anymore. So I was there, and I had a phone, so I just sat by the phone. The phone rang hot. There were all these men who who wanted to really. It wasn't a sexual thing. They had a lot to get off their chests. And they really wanted to talk to someone who they thought might possibly come from a place so far away that I might be sympathetically inclined towards them. And one of them actually said to me, as he gave me a copy of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto at our meeting, which he'd signed to Anna, as a memento of our meeting. But I'm only used to the authors actually signing books. So he was signing for Marx. And he thought that I would somehow take this and sow the seeds of communism in a far-flung corner of the earth like here. But before the book was published, I did send all the chapters about each Stasi man to each Stasi man because I thought, well, it's only fair, and I think it would be good to know if I have anything wrong, because I was taping all these interviews, everything was happening in German, then I have to translate everything, and then I was writing it all up. And I didn't get any response for them. And then after it came out, it was a whole other story. So they didn't really like how I represented them. Yeah.
Funny that. But you do get this extraordinary cast of characters, basically, don't you? One after the other, who you go and sit in their very often strange rooms, and they will tell you lots of things. Did that surprise you? I mean, did you expect to be given such detail in the beginning?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I wasn't, in the first instance, so interested in them. I was much more interested in these heroes that I was finding. But having been briefly quite a bad lawyer, I was interested in what happens when you're working for a large organisation and doing things that might go against the grain for you. And I was thinking, if you've lived your whole life in working for a cause and possibly believing in that cause very strongly, and then from one day to another, that cause is discredited and the state apparatus that you worked for disappears, how much of that was constitutive of yourself? Those beliefs that we have are extremely strong, and you can do a lot in their name that might niggle you a little bit or a lot. So then perhaps that sense of belief becomes all the more important. Yeah. So I was interested in what happens to a person psychologically if that's happened to you. And I think in a secondary sense, I was also interested in how far, and not in a judgmental way, I feel this about things that I've done, but how far can you recognize something that you've done as having been wrong? How much remorse can a human being kind of bear? And the answer is not very much. So you do anything to put that away and you just don't feel it. There was one of them I spoke to who was the most well-educated and the most sophisticated of them, and his name was Herr Bornsack. He was, I think, the only one who let me use his real name, and he had been in essentially the kind of foreign affairs arm of the Secret Service, and his responsibility had been to send misinformation out into West Germany, to bribe politicians there to change the votes in the West German parliament, to run West German journalists as agents or bribe them to change the news, to run smear campaigns about ex-Nazis in the West and so on. It was sophisticated disinformation work. And he met me, and drink after drink after drink, he just eventually said to me, I spent 26 years of my life telling lies. And I just thought, and now he's drinking, now he's really, really drinking to deal with that. But he was the only man who was able to sort of get that much of a grip on himself in that way. And I think it's because he had this big exposure to the West. So he was kind of less cocooned in this ideology of the East because he'd been running agents in the West, and he was sort of more aware of the value of the lies he was telling, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were an extraordinary bunch. Did you find yourself liking any of them at all? Was there anything nice about any
Does
of
it
them?
seem like I
Did
like
you have
them?
favourites?
A favourite pet Stasi man? That's a really great question that I haven't been asked before. I was sympathetic to Herr Bonsack. I really was. And
How do you spell that one? Is that the
Bohnssack,
Oh, yeah, that one. Yep.
Bonsack.
Yep.
No, the others were really mostly on a kind of spectrum of creepiness to self-righteousness, really, I would say, you know. But I mean, as a very flawed human being myself, of course I have some sympathy with the idea that you do things for a justification that might later be proved wrong, or you know, like I understand that at a human level. But these were people who were still saying, you know, that their work in convincing people to spy on their neighbours and friends and colleagues and children was a righteous thing in a good cause, when clearly it was absolutely discredited and beyond the needs of the state, beyond the needs of politics. It was a pathological surveillance regime, and just the inability to see that, and it had been so extreme. I think there's, you know, I think it's a very human thing, but also politically it's very important to see what happened, you know, as quickly as possible for the victims and heroes who had seen it, and not to respect those victims and heroes, and so to continue in the belief that what you were doing was right, becomes then not just a political thing, but also not just a personal thing, but also a political one. Yeah. So I guess the narrative is juggling those two levels.
Yeah, there's an interesting piece in the book with your musician friend, who I love, Klaus, who says in one of the later conversations about he thinks the Stasi have really, you know, we've been hard enough on them already, and there's all these different kinds of conscience.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting thing to say. What do you reckon he meant by that? There's all these different kinds of, I guess, of feeling bad or worse, or what degree of bad do you feel for being a Stasi or for being an informer? Is that what he meant? That, you know, there's all these different degrees of conscience?
I think he meant that, I think that he didn't want to be judging anyone. Yeah. He just wanted to say people did what they could or what they felt they had to. This is a man who was the East Germany's so-called Mick Jagger. He fronted a band called the Klaus Renft Combo, and he was Klaus Renft, and he was a really big rock star and in the 60s and 70s. And he was, like, if you think about the Beatles and the Stones, and the Beatles are kind of more clean-cut and the Stones are kind of looser, he was the Mick Jagger, because he was the head of this wilder rock band. And in the GDR, like in all dictatorships really, or authoritarian regimes, you had to get permission as an artist or a writer or a performer to perform. And so he had to go, this is all described in the book, and kind of audition for the government to get the license to perform, which is how governments control. Well, now, of course, I don't know what's happening in China or North Korea. There's probably more sophisticated ways of controlling people. But there was a license to perform, and he was not given it. You can actually, I think you can see this on YouTube these days. Comrade Erschlegel says to him, to his face, "We are telling you today, we're not going to give you this license to perform, and what's more, you no longer exist." And Klaus had the presence of mind to stick a tape recorder in those days, an old-fashioned tape recorder, down his pants and turn it on. So that's where the recording comes from that you can hear on YouTube, from Klaus's pants, rock star's pants. And he says to her, "What do you mean? I'm standing in front of you. What do you mean I no longer exist?" And she says, "As a band, you no longer exist." And then, because it was such a controlled state, he said, well, it was actually true. What they did was there was one music catalogue for the whole of East Germany that had in it all the music you could buy in the country. And all of those catalogues from every single music store were pulled back into the state and pulped. And they were reprinted so as to leave out Klaus Renft combo as if they had never existed. So now, of course, these things are much easier. Digitally, you can erase people and things, but in those days, that's what they did. And anyway, so I think he was saying with conscience, people did what they could. If you're a frightened person and the Stasi come to you and say, we would like to meet with you every couple of weeks, just to have a bit of a chat about everyone and everything, why don't you? You wouldn't know if you refused what would happen to you. You wouldn't know what would happen to your child. If you had, like in Julia's family, another woman in the book, you know, they said to her, well, your sister's interested in playing piano at the con. You know, why don't you come and have a chat with us every couple of weeks? So the price is, this is how it works in every, you know, this is universal. I think this is how the mafia works, this is how everything works. It is bribing you with the well-being of your loved ones, really. And I think Klaus was just saying, I can't judge somebody who bends to that. You know, how can you? And I agree with him, how can you? The other thing I think that he says in that conversation is that I sensed from him was that he kind of psychologically survived by not condemning other people. So he just said, I'm going to take this as easy as I can. Even though what happened to him was horrendous, I'm not going to let it ruin me. So somehow he could switch on this thing inside him that just gave him a kind of psychological soft landing, which wasn't the case for the others in the book at all.
Yeah. No, we're running out of time alarmingly fast, so I want to just, there's a couple of things I want to get to before we open for questions. So tuck away your question for the next 10 minutes. But I just wanted to say too that, you know, you're leaving some of this very disheartening material with some wonderful irony and humour. And I just want to read out this very small piece because just in case you think that it's a very dour and very, very depressing read, there are some wonderful pieces like this when we're talking to Herr Bock, when you're talking to him anyway. And in this exchange, you ask him on, you know, they do this thing called operational control.
Yes.
And you ask him, you know, what were they doing when they do this? And you say, who were they? It's about how you decide who the enemy is. And you say, well, who were they? And he says, they were enemies. And you say, well, how did you know they were enemies? And he says, well, in his soft voice, once an investigation was started into someone, that meant there was suspicion of enemy activity. And you say to the reader, this was perfect dictator logic. We investigate you, therefore you are the enemy. And that's basically how it worked out, wasn't it? I want to move very quickly on to the new Germany. I'm staying very briefly with Herr Bock because you say in the book that Herr Bock is now advising West German firms that want to buy up East German assets. And you say, of course, once more getting the trust of the people and selling them cheap. And that many Stasi have found work in insurance and telemarketing and real estate. And you say that, of course, they're schooled in the art of convincing people to do things against their own self-interest.
Yes, that's my little dig at capitalism.
Yes. Wonderful. Anyway, I was going to talk about some of the lovely kind of get smart, kind of Hogan's heroes kind of moments in the book, of which there are plenty, but I'll have to stick to the serious stuff now. Now, where did I want to go? Okay. It sort of seems to me that exemplified, you know, that notion that you raise, and this insight that you have, that in the GDR, people were required to acknowledge an assortment of fictions as fact. Some of these fictions were fundamental. You say the idea that human nature is a work in progress which can be improved on, and that communism is the way to do it, that East Germans were not the Germans responsible for the Holocaust, and that the GDR was in fact a multi-party democracy. So I guess all countries, you know, operate on their own unique fictions, don't they? You know, America's busy making itself great again, and Australia's the land of the fair go. But did that analysis, you know, that insight that you had prompt you to look more closely at places like your own home country, like Australia, to see, how that works elsewhere. It's pretty extraordinary that, the way it was working in the GDR was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty sensitive to surveillance states.
Yes.
I'm pretty sensitive to what's going on with things like the raid of the ABC or, the government hunting down sources who are leaking misfeasance in the military, raiding people's homes. Fortunately, we live in a country with a free press, and there's quite a big fight back going on about that. But yeah, it did sensitise me to that. I think you say the book is funny. The book is really funny, but that's because the people in it also, like Miriam and Julia, if you live in a place like that, the only way you can kind of manage it is to, if you really see what's going on, is to see how perverse it is to see the irony in it and to kind of laugh about it. I mean, I think that's true.
Absolutely.
So it's not just my humour; it's theirs that I'm representing as well. I think today, so the repercussions in Germany are really interesting today. So East Germany is this country. The wall comes down 30 years ago, and I was just thinking there was these beautiful slides up here before. I'm not sure whether there's some of the wall and so on. And the fiction was that East Germany had never been part of the Nazi regime, basically. So the Russians took the eastern bit of Germany, and the western part was divided up by the other Second World War victors, so France, Britain, and the US. That became democratic West Germany, and the East Germany was the satellite sphere of the USSR. And so it meant that overnight the people who lived there went from being in a Nazi regime to being in a communist regime, in the regime that they had just been fighting the communists. So from one minute to the next, they went from trying to kill the Russians to being their brothers and comrades and so on. So the lies started very early, that propaganda started very early. And it extended to, we got rid of all our Nazis, we piffed them all into West Germany. West Germany is the capitalist, fascist heir of the Nazi dictatorship and so on and so forth, none of which was true. So, but then when the wall falls, you've got a whole country of Germans who have not at all the same sense of historical responsibility for the Holocaust and the Second World War as the West Germans have. So they have no, it's not part of their history. It's not part of their responsibility in that way. So that creates a very different relationship, for instance, now with the far right and so on. Yeah. So anyway, we're probably out of time.
Yes, just want to ask you too, whether do you think, I mean, certainly Queenslanders used to be accused of being different to the rest of Australia. And I just wonder whether nearly 30 years under a regime like that, do you think it's possible that people do see themselves as different, a different race, that they're changed, that they're separate?
Well, that's a very big question. I mean, that is the question. There was East Germany existed for 40 years. It had this very strong ideology of its own nationhood, its own politics, its own socialism, and its own national pride. And that has been... when on the 4th of November 30 years ago, so just last week, there was a massive demonstration in East Berlin, 100,000 people. A lot of them were Stasi, but, a fair proportion of the 100,000 were actually, citizens and brave people. And there were civil rights activists who addressed that big gathering in East Berlin, but also Markus Wolf addressed that. Markus Wolf was the head of the overseas spy service of the Stasi. And what they wanted was to reform the nation, but for the nation to continue to exist. People were loyal to their nations. I mean, when I live outside of Australia, I am constantly surprised at how loyal to Australia I am, how kind of Australian I feel, how exaggeratedly Australian I feel. I think it's possible when you're at home to underestimate how much of the sort of pie of your heart contains Australia, and not in a how good are we type of way, just in a sort of very real and deep way. And what happened when the wall fell was that all of a sudden it was the discussion was no longer, we want to make our country better, we want to reform it, we want to be freer and better and fairer than West Germany. The discussion was of unification, and that unification was felt in the eastern states, I'm generalizing, but was felt as a takeover. And all of a sudden people lose their nation. That's a very strange thing to happen. If Australia was suddenly, I don't know, taken over by someone else and ceased to exist, it would be very hard for us. I think it's very difficult.
Yeah. So many questions. I really wanted to ask you whether you think I'm not expecting an answer to this because I'll have to go to questions, but selfishly I want to get to this, that whether something like a wall gets into your psyche. There's that lovely story you give us about the two brothers who somehow find themselves in possession of this tiny bit of scrap of land that's neither West Berlin nor East Berlin. And somehow they get it and they grow vegetables on it. Wonderful, lovely story. But then one day they have a big falling out. They can't resolve this argument, so they put up a fence straight down the middle of this scrap of land. And it made me think, yeah, there's a wall in your head, that just doesn't go away.
Well, I think, people are building walls now, aren't they? Trump wants to build a wall. There's wall in Palestine.
Yeah.
I think, a wall is a symbol of the utter. A wall is, it's the failure of politics, isn't it?
Yep.
And walls and wars are the failure of
absolutely.
politics.
We have our own wall here. It's called our refugee policy, I think. It's a visible one. Okay, we're going to go to questions. There's going to be mics on both sides, I think, and please ask some. We've got 10 whole minutes. There's one on the side.
Yeah, I just should say the book, as Kristina says, it's a total riot. And
it's a wonderful read. I read it for the second time, and it's just a, rollicking read. Yes.
I'd just like to know what part your German language skills had in the construction of this story, whether it mattered that you spoke the language.
It always astonishes me that no one asks me that question, so I'm really happy that you asked me that question. I think in English, we read so much stuff in English that we assume that everything kind of just exists in English. So in East Germany, the second language they learnt was Russian. Nobody can speak English. And I think it was very important that I could speak German because it meant that I was just me travelling around talking to people in their own language. No translator, no fuss, no nothing. And now that I'm the age that I am, I also look back and I think that I was in disguise as a young woman. And the Stasi men, I just think maybe it's something to do with patriarchy where they just think that young women are really harmless, And because I was functioning in German, I did have to listen to them, really, I had to really concentrate on them. So I had to pay them a lot of attention, as you do when you're doing an interview. And so they had a lot to tell me. And for people like Miriam and Julia and Farpal and Klaus, it just meant that the rapport was very immediate, because you could do it in German. I taped everything because my German leaves quite a lot to be desired. And I wanted to have everything so that I could translate what they said exactly and quote them exactly. And I also always had notebooks there, which I would recommend to anybody who's doing anything like this, because it means that if you have a catastrophe with your technology, you've got your notes. But also it means that you can be looking down and writing, either in English or in German. And sometimes when you don't look at people, they will tell you more too, because it's, it's less confronting or something. So, and I'd be writing things down like, brown cardigan, another brown cardigan, brown linoleum, statue of Stalin.
Any more questions? There's one in the front down here. Okay, sure.
Actually, don't really have a question. I would like to thank you as an East German to write this book. You have put a lot of thought and feeling in it. You wrote Julia Behrens went to America. Have you ever heard from her what she's doing these days?
No, she's the one person I've really lost touch with. She went to America. She went back to Berlin. I don't know. She was very, very. I was very sorry to lose touch with her. But she was very appealing to me. She was exactly my age, and I would love to know. Miriam, I'm still in touch with. Klaus died. Frau Paul died. Charleston died. I mean, people have been dying, but yeah, no, Julia, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
And thank you for writing the book. It really opened my eyes to what happened in East Germany after the war. But when I was reading it, I often thought of Michel Foucault's principle that he who has the power creates the truth. And he was writing about France at the time, not about Germany. But you can kind of see that, particularly with Donald Trump and all these people who think just because I say something is true, it is true, and everyone needs to believe it's true. And I felt the Stasi was, as it was described in your book, the perfect example of how that's extended to a state apparatus.
Exactly.
And I often wonder now with digital technology how much we now don't know we're being judged on in terms of, what is true and what is not true. And I was just wondering whether you've kind of extended it into a digital age at all, what happened in East Germany to what's happening now around the world.
Yeah, I think it's something that if I wasn't careful, I could spend my whole life, doing. Sometimes I think I look at, if I'm having a chat in my kitchen, I don't have Alexa or Google or any of that stuff, but I have an iPhone and I'll be talking in my kitchen about something with no phones on, no apps open or anything, and then I'll be talking about something, I don't know, Thailand or something, and then all the ads for Thailand come up on my computer. That's really spooky stuff, yeah. And I just think in general, and possibly it's because of my experience going and writing this book, but I really do think that that kind of power and concentration of effectively stolen personal knowledge, it just doesn't end well if that's concentrated without people being able to find out what is known about them and control it. I really, sometimes I look at the world today and I just think the Stasi men must feel that things are normalised for them,
Yes.
Or I get pretty sensitive about some of the stuff that Peter Dutton says, The thing about someone in power like Trump saying something and then it must be true is the definition of a dictator, really, because in order to make it be true, it means you can't be contradicted. So there's punishment for people who speak out in contradiction to you. So the first thing you do is say, for instance, that the press are the enemies of the people. So he's done that already, So you see, the playbook of authoritarianism is not particularly inventive. It's the same generation after generation. The technologies are different, but that impetus to power and to control what can be said about you is the same. And that's why the Stasi men didn't even though they told me all this stuff and I put it in, they were so unused to being anywhere where there could possibly be another point of view that wasn't sanctioned. So a group of ex-Stasi men sued my publisher in 2004 after the book came out because they wanted a paragraph taken out about them. And I'd been on tour and I'd been in the book was launched in Leipzig in the Runde Ecke. And when I got up on stage, I looked down. My publisher was West German and I could see her knees knocking behind the lectern. She had this fur coat on and I thought, she's really not used to being in the East, and the knees are knocking. And then I got up and I looked down and the first two rows were like ex-Stasi guys, really cranky, brill cream bomber jackets, really, really, really cranky. And
From Central Casting.
Central Casting. And I looked at them and then I started talking and they reached into the jackets and pulled out notebooks and they started writing notes. At which point I just thought, I'm not going to be scared. You know what? You guys really like frightening people, but tonight's not your night. And I thought that was fine. Then at the end of the session, when it's opened up for questions, they all kind of left. And then someone stood up at the back and said, why does it take an Australian to write about this stuff? You know, why aren't we? This happened to me. I mean, my son was in prison, blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, well, I think your answer has just left the room. You know, the dictatorship is over, but everyone is still here. Those scary men are still walking around the streets and in the supermarkets. Then when I got home, I was at home in my attic writing in 2004, and I got this email saying that this group of ex-Stasi, so one of them I talked to was called the Insight. They made a committee. They used to meet after the fall of the wall. And the committee was called the Das Insider Komitee. Perfect name for a set of ex-spies. But then they kind of got a bit, you know, they got a bit au fait with democratic lingo, and they changed their name to the Society for the Protection of Civil Liberties and the Dignity of Man.
It's always the opposite of what it actually is, isn't it? Always.
Which is another thing that always happens. So when you see, you know, like the Freedom of the Press Act, watch out.
Yes. Yeah.
And they were suing me for things that I had put in the book that were true about what groups of people like them had done to former civil rights activists, like cut their brake leads or take their children after school for a couple of hours and deliver pornography to their wives and all this stuff. Yeah, and so that paragraph had to come out of the book because the knock-kneed publisher didn't defend the action properly. In the latest edition in Germany, it's gone back. I said, could you please put it back in? You don't need to, a change publisher. You don't need to relitigate, but please put it back in, and you can just black it out so that it looks like a redacted Stasi file. And it's got an asterisk at the end of it that says this bit of the book has been redacted because of an action by the Society for Civil Liberties and Protection of Dignity of Man. That was fun. See, it's funny.
One last question because we've run out of time.
Is the reason that the Stasi could continue to live amongst the local people, unlike the Nazis who fled and pretended and went to South America, was that part of the reunification package deal?
So that's a big question. There was no Truth and Reconciliation Commission or anything like that. There were laws that required that in certain bits of the public service and so on, if you had been an informer or active for the Stasi, you had to leave your job. By and large, there was no punishment for ex-Stasi or high-ups or people. There were no big trials. There were like 2 or 3 trials. There were no repercussions. In fact, the Stasi, by and large, have done much, much better than the former political prisoners and the people that they oppressed. So they brought in, because these are men used to power, and they had money. They had these purloined billions from the state. So the country was absolutely broke, but there was upwards of 11 billion in state coffers that mysteriously disappeared and is still being kind of gotten back from Cuba and here and there, but it's never going to get back. Mysteriously, after the fall of the wall, all of these taxi companies and angling clubs and pubs were bought up by men who had no capital, who were ex-firm, ex-Stasi. And they brought an action in the West German, in the federal courts, the high-ranking ones and others, saying that they deserved to get the full, relatively high pensions that they would have awarded themselves in their own state relative to the others there, and they won. So they are much, much richer. Look, they changed their name. The people in politics changed their name from the PDS, the Party of Democratic Social... No, from the SED, Socialist Unity Party, to the PDS, the Party of Democratic Socialism, after the wall fell. So the same personnel and possibly the money. And then they morph into, it's 30 years on now, but they joined with the Linke. And they went and worked in firms. And Miriam worked in she was a radio producer, and she worked for state radio, like Radio National, but it's state-based. And this is not in the book because this is what she's doing afterwards. I don't think it's in the book. Her immediate superior was a Stasi so she's a political prisoner. Her immediate superior was a Stasi informer, and someone who is still there, very high up in public radio, had a high up position in the SED regime. So what she would notice was that if this is in new democratic state of Saxony, they're controlling the news. So if something comes, some new revelation of Stasi perfidy or this spying or this person in prison or whatever, they would relegate that to really low down in the order of news or not at all, or make it harmless for harmless. So it was very hard for her. So there were all sorts of kind of I could write another book.
And we would like to read it, and we could keep on listening, I think, for another hour or so. But I think I fear we've run out of time.
Well, there was one, or that I am up to date. Yes, yes, I am. I'm working on it. Yeah, I'm working on it. Yeah.
It's always the question that writers dread.
It's sort of like wonderful to have you here, and I've been waiting for a while.
I know. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry
Not
about
to
that.
make you feel any worse than you do.
I'm sorry about that. I had too many babies, and but they're getting older now, so I can, yeah.
I really did want to just round off by talking about the fact that we really cannot be complacent, especially in this state where we did have that regime, and I can see from some of your faces that you knew what it was, where people did have files kept on them by the special branch of police, where people did have their phones tapped. People and protest was banned. People were bashed. Yes, so we can never be too careful, and we're now living in that media landscape where journalism itself is under threat, and free media is under siege, and we really just cannot be complacent at all. If you'll just indulge me, I really did want to just give you this one quote, just to send you away with, in case any of you have forgotten this. 1986, in the Australian Financial Review, Joe Bjelke-Petersen said, "The greatest thing that could happen to the state and the nation is when we get rid of the media. Then we would live in peace and tranquility, and no one would know anything." I was working for the Australian at the time, and none of us, it was emblazoned on our brains. It was quite extraordinary. What an amazing discussion. Thank you, Anna Funder. Will you all join me in helping thanking Anna's going to be signing copies outside. So if you'd like your copy, or if you haven't got one, if you haven't got one already, they're available outside, and I think Anna's going to hang about and sign them. So thanks very much for your attendance. You've been a terrific audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna and Kristina, for that conversation. And as a historian, there have been literally a couple of hundred sort of scholarly studies of the Stasi. When you've got something like 180 shelf kilometres of files, that's enough to keep an almost infinite number of historians employed indefinitely. But what Anna's writing has done has kind of put human faces to that history, and she also very engagingly recreates her own process of discovery. And she's shared, with the help of Kristina, she shared more of that discovery process with us all tonight in a very engaging way. So I'd like to thank both Kristina and Anna. Do have an announcement on behalf of the State Library that Talking Ideas has one more event for this year. On Monday evening, Dr. Karl Kruszelnicki will be in the house to present his random road trip through science. There are still, as of when I received this notice, there were still some tickets available, so please check the State Library website. And just to repeat Kristina's reminder that the re-release of Stasiland with new cover art is available for sale outside. Kristina, is your book here too? And also the book Shell by Kristina Olsson are both for sale in the foyer, and you can have your books personally signed by both our authors. So thank you and enjoy the evening. Thank you. Yes, certainly, Anna. Sorry, just...
What's happened since? I tried to address for the German audience in an afterword to Stasiland that deals with the 30 years after. And that's come out in German, but it's being published in English in the monthly at the end of this month as a really, it's a big essay, it's nearly 9,000 words. So if anyone is interested in what we didn't get to talk about tonight, it's sort of in there really, as much as I could do.
Thanks, Anna.